Transforming was a mechanic first introduced in the first trip to Innistrad. This mechanic allows you to flip a card from its front side to its back side after a certain condition has been met, usually on an activated or triggered ability. Cards can transform into basically any card type from any other card type. This mechanic is very flavorful and has had a lot of very powerful cards. Of course, not every card can be a winner, and today we're going to go over some of those losers. Starting us off at number 10, we have Ludevic's Test Subject. This is a 0/3 lizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has Defender, meaning it can't attack. It has the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 blue to put a hatchling counter on it, and then if there are 5 or more hatchling counters on it, you remove all of them and transform it. It transforms into Ludevic's Abomination. This is a 13/13 lizard horror with trample, which means it deals excess combat damage to defending player or planeswalker. So, what's so bad about this card? Well, it's mostly just very underwhelming. All in all, you have to spend 12 mana to flip the card, and a 13/13 with trample is an okay payoff for this, but not quite good enough. The issue is mainly that Test Subject is very easy to just kill. Being a 0/3 with no protection abilities means it dies to most removal spells. Since you're trying to put 12 mana into it, it being the easy to remove target is a pretty big problem. However, the worst part of how easy it is to kill is how much control your opponent will have as to when they kill it. Test Subject doesn't get any better the more hatchling counters you put on it. It's very all or nothing. So, if your opponent just waits for you to put a ton of counters on Test Subject and then kills it in response to putting the 5th counter on it, you'll be out a ton of mana. It's worth noting that at the time this was in Standard, a Lightning Bolt was also in Standard. This was an instant just deals 3 damage to any target for 1 red mana, and is incredibly powerful. It also does just enough to kill Test Subject, which made playing Test Subject a lot riskier than it would be even normally. The final nail in the coffin is that Test Subject just doesn't do anything while it's sitting on the board untransformed. Most transform cards that are good either have a pretty good front half or are very easy to transform. Test Subject doesn't do anything until you flip it, and it's very hard to actually transform. You can't really block anything with it since it has so little toughness, and the few creatures it can block won't die since it doesn't have any power. Test Subject is basically just a really bad mana sink. And at number 9, we have Neglected Heirloom. This is an artifact equipment with a mana cost of 1. It has Equip 1 and the ability where the equipped creature gets +1/+1. It also has the ability where whenever equipped creature transforms, you transform into an Ashmouth Blade. This is an artifact equipment with Equip 3 and the ability where the equipped creature gets +3/+3 in First Strike. First Strike makes it so the creature deals combat damage for creatures without the keyword. Both sides of Heirloom are just average. Ashmouth gives a bigger bonus than most equipment at its mana value, but the hefty equip cost is far enough to balance it out. However, Heirloom does have one huge upside. When the creature it's attached to transforms, it will transform along with it, suddenly giving a huge boost while only asking for 2 mana to get equipped. This is great since actually paying 3 mana to put Ashmouth Blade into a creature is just a bit too expensive for what it does. The rub here is just that actually flipping Heirloom just isn't worth it. Heirloom isn't impactful enough to see play on its own, so you need to be able to flip it for the card to be any good. The issue is that building your deck to consistently transform most of the playable transform creatures is just a bit hard to also equip them with Heirloom first. For example, some of the easiest cards to flip in the game would be things like Heir of Falkenrath, a 2/1 that flips into a 3/2 with flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by flying creatures, whenever you pitch a card to use its ability. Now, paying 4 mana to play Heir, the Heirloom, and equip them and gain a 6/5 with flying in First Strike is a really good rate. However, if your opponent kills your Heir, which won't be too hard, you'll be in a really rough spot, since you'll be getting 2 for 1 on top of the tempo loss from being out 4 mana. And if you don't have the blade on Heir, it's not really worth going down a card for a 3/2 flyer. So you'll have to find some way to make pitching a card with Heir of Falkenrath better in order for the deck to be playable. But if you do that, your deck will get clunkier, and this is sort of the issue that Heirloom always ran into. The card was just too hard to get out while also enabling your transform cards, which is why it was mostly left to the side its entire time in Standard. And at number 8, we have Startled Awake. This is a sorcerer with the mana cost of 2 and 2 blue. It is the effect where target player mills 13 cards. You can also pay 3 and 2 blue to put it from your graveyard to the battlefield transformed, but only as a sorcery. The backside is Persistent Nightmare, though it probably would have been called Reoccurring Nightmare had that not already been the name of a different card. Persistent Nightmare is a 1/1 nightmare with Skulk, meaning it can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it bounces back into your hand. This means that Startled Awake can, over time, completely deck your opponent out all by itself. Now, the first thing we should talk about this card is the Skulk keyword. In Shadows over Innistrad block, they tried to introduce a new evasive keyword to the game. However, this quickly proved to be completely terrible. Skulk very rarely worked, and while that's not the biggest issue for Startled Awake, it did end up mattering. There were a lot of really good 1-power creatures in the same standard as Startled Awake. One of the best creatures in that format was Tharband Inspector, a 1/2 for white that gives you a clue when it enters the battlefield. The clue lets you pay 2 and sacrifice it to draw you a card. So if your opponent had a Tharband Inspector in play, your entire Startled Awake plan would be entirely walled up by a 1-drop that cycles. This was true for a lot of matchups. Startled Awake was just very, very slow, and way too easy to stop. Basically, any other win condition was better in the format for control decks, as Startled Awake was just far too easy to stop from actually working. And at number 7, we have Chosen of Markov. This is a 2/2 human with a mana cost of 2 and 1 black. It is the ability where you can tap it and tap an untapped vampire you control to transform it. It flips into Markov's Servant. This is a 4/4 vampire, and that's it. This card is here representing all of the understated, not very good creatures that transform. There are plenty of creatures that don't have particularly interesting front or backsides and just cost too much mana for it to be worth playing them outside of limited, even if their transform conditions aren't that bad. Cards like Aberrant Researcher are pretty okay, but are just too small on their backside to be worth writing home about. Researcher is a 3/2 flyer that flips into a 5/5 flyer if you can mill an instant or sorcery during your upkeep, but costs 4 mana. It's a perfectly decent card, but it's just too expensive to ever see play in constructed formats. Chosen was chosen, or well, selected for this list, because requiring you to tap another vampire can make it pretty hard to actually transform, which makes it even worse than the average badly statted flip creature. A 3 mana 2/2 is a pretty atrocious stat line, and a 4/4 for 3 isn't good enough to make up for that, at least not if you have to do this much to get it. Tapping 2 of your creatures isn't the biggest cost ever, but it is quite slow. This makes Chosen very slow, especially if you're playing an aggro deck and your plan is to try to kill your opponent as fast as possible. It's worth comparing this to similar cards like Town Gossip Monger. Monger is a 1/1 for 1 that allows you to tap it another creature you control to transform it into a 2/3 that has to attack each combat if able, and lets you pay 2 to give it +1/+0 until the end of the turn. Gossip Monger is generally a lot better than Chosen on a few axes. It didn't ask for a specific type of creature for one, but it also cost far less. This means you can play Gossip Monger on turn 1, and then on turn 2, play another creature and tap it to flip your Gossip Monger. The tempo here is a lot better since you're only losing out on attacking with a different 1-drop for 1 turn, rather than losing out on attacking with a better 3-drop as you are with Chosen. Not to mention that Inside Rabble is a lot better as a 2/3 for 1 with fire breathing than a 4/4 with no abilities is for 3 mana. With all that said, Chosen of Markov is at least very flavorful. While requiring you to tap a vampire does make it a lot worse, it also does a good job representing the idea of a human being turned by a vampire. While this card isn't good outside of limited, the flavor makes the card more than worth printing. And at number 6, we have Elbrus, the Binding Blade. This is a legendary artifact equipment with a mana cost of 7. It has Equip 1 and the abilities where the equipped creature gets +1/+0. And whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you unattach Elbrus and transform it. It transforms into Wethengar Unbound, a legendary 13/13 demon with flying, intimidate, meaning it can't be blocked except by artifact creatures or creatures that share a color with it, and trample. It also has the ability where whenever a player loses the game, you put 13 +1/+1 counters on it. While Elbrus does ask for less mana overall to transform than Test Subject does, the extra hoops it asks you to jump through make it a lot harder to actually transform. You have to have a creature in the field to equip it to, meaning you need an entirely different card for it to ever do anything. This is true of most equipment, but most equipment make up for that by instantly turning anything you put them on into a threat. Elbrus doesn't quite get there, since the creature can just eternally be chump blocked and you won't really get anywhere. What makes Elbrus so bad compared to Test Subject is that it asks for 7 mana up front. While it only asks for 8 mana overall, you have to get a total of 7 islands in the field for you to ever be able to put Elbrus onto the field at all. With a mana sink card like Test Subject, you can still get there by sinking mana into it even without ever hitting 7 lands. And it's worth mentioning that hitting 7 lands is very difficult unless you're purposefully trying to get that much mana. Overall, while Elbrus is very fun, it's far too clunky to ever actually transform in the average game of Magic. And at number 5, we have Grizzled Outcasts. This is a 4/4 human werewolf with a mana cost of 4 and 1 green. It has the ability where, at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, you transform it into a Crawlin Horde Wantons. This is a 7/7 werewolf with the ability where, at the beginning of each upkeep, if either player casts 2 or more spells that turn, you transform it back into the Outcasts. This card is here representing the entire werewolf mechanic, which all the way up until the new was revisited of Innistrad and Midnight Hunt, were very underwhelming. We've made an entire video about this mechanic in the past. If you want an entire breakdown of why this mechanic is bad, you can just go there. Grizzled Outcast is a particularly bad wolf, as even if you got the back half, it wouldn't be very good. You see, there are cards like Gigantosaurus, which is a massive 10/10 for 5 green. As huge as this card is, it just doesn't do anything. Your opponent can just chump block it forever or hit it with any kill spell. The fact is, fat stats isn't enough for a card to be good if it costs 5 or more mana. You really need some sort of evasion or additional value to really be good. Considering how bad a 5 mana 10/10 is, it's not a surprise that a 5 mana 7/7 isn't good, especially one that's going to be a 4/4 more often than not. Werewolves had a rocky road getting to a playable place, and Grizzled Outcasts is a pretty good representative of this fact. And at number 4, we have Era of Enlightenment. This is an enchantment saga with a mana cost of 1 and 1 white. Sagas are enchantments with several chapters. How they work is that when they enter the battlefield or the start of your pre-combat main phase, you put a lore counter on them. Then you trigger the ability that corresponds to the number of lore counters on the card. When the last is triggered, you sack the saga. The first chapter here lets you scry 2, meaning you look at the top 2 cards of your library, then put them either on top or the bottom of your deck in any order you want. Chapter 2 gains you 2 life, and the final chapter exiles the saga, transforming it and returning it to the battlefield. It comes back as a Hand of Enlightenment, a 2/2 spirit enchantment creature with first strike. This was part of a whole theme of cards that were sagas on one side and transformed into creatures at their last chapter in the said Kamigawa Neo Dynasty. Now, there were certainly a number of these cards that were, at the very least, decent. Fable of the Mirrorbreaker has turned out to be a multi-format all-star, seen play as far back as Legacy. However, this design does have a few issues. Namely, it's just a bit slow. Sagas tend to be very slow, grindy value engines, considering they take several turns to give you their full effect. So the front side of these cards need to have pretty strong effects, as even if the back half is really good, waiting 3 turns for it makes it too easy for your opponent to respond to the threat. Era of Enlightenment doesn't give you anything special at any point. Scrying 2 is a fine effect, but not quite worth an entire card. And gaining 2 life is an even worse effect. Getting a 2/2 with first strike as your payoff is just kind of sad after waiting that many turns. You can't even attack with it that turn since it just entered the battlefield. Now, a 2/2 first strike that gained you 2 life and scry 2 when you played it would legitimately be very good. But time is everything in Magic. Having to wait so long for all these effects does a lot to kill any playability the card has. And at number 3, we have Chalice of Life. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 3. It has the ability where you can tap it to gain 1 life. Then, if you have at least 10 more life than your starting life total, it flips over into Chalice of Death. This is an artifact with an ability where you can tap it to have target player lose 5 life. It's worth pointing out to start that Chalice of Death is legitimately a very powerful payoff. Putting your opponent on a 4-turn clock with no way for them to interact with it is really hard to deal with. The issue is just getting there. Getting to 30 life is by no means an easy feat. Your opponent can just attack you and manually lower your life total if they ever really need to. If you just spam life gain effects without answering your opponent's board, their board will just slowly grow in terms of damage. And it will very quickly not only outpace your life gain, it will also outpace the damage from Chalice of Death if it were already transformed. Even decks that aren't great at dealing damage, like control decks, will probably be able to stop you from using whatever sources of life gain you'll be leaning on to get over the 30 life threshold. Now, you could try and run Chalice of Life as the finisher for some sort of control deck, and that would probably be better than trying to spam life gain effects. But Chalice of Life makes Startled Awake look like one of the best control finishers ever printed. It would take 10 turns to wait for Chalice of Life to flip, and that's assuming you never took any damage. Control decks will usually take a few hits before they start to establish control of a game, so it will almost always take far longer. All in all, Chalice of Life just does far too little on its front half to really be viable. And at number 2, we have Golden Guardian. This is a 4/4 golem artifact creature with the mana cost of 4. It has Defender and the ability where you can pay 2 to have Guardian fight target creature you control, and then whenever it dies this turn, you return it to the battlefield transformed. It comes back as Gold Forge Garrison. This is a land with the abilities where you can tap it to add 2 mana of any one color, and you can pay 4 and tap the Garrison to create a 4/4 golem artifact creature token. This is another transform card with a very powerful backside that's made horrible by how bad its front side is. A 4/4 for 4 mana isn't good enough. Cards like Polukranos World Eater, which is a 4 mana 5/5 with upside, wasn't good enough to break anything. It was just a decent static card that's seen some competitive play. Guardian not only doesn't have an upside, it has a downside. A 4/4 Defender for 4 is kind of laughably bad, so you have to actually find a way to flip Guardian for it to be playable. The thing is, Guardian is kind of the perfect size for it to be terrible. It's not big enough to actually be an imposing card, as we just said. But it's also just big enough that it's very hard to play another creature that can fight and kill your Guardian that will also survive. The best card to do this with, at least back in Guardian Standard, was probably Rekindling Phoenix. This was a 4/3 flyer for 2 and 2 red with the ability where, when it dies, you make a 0/1 elemental creature token that will pop itself and reanimate the Phoenix during your upkeep, as well as give it haste. However, even with a 4-drop that could flip your Guardian for you without dying permanently, trying to flip Guardian was just too risky. Paying 2 mana into the ability only for either half of your combo to get removed was a pretty huge tempo loss. And once you finally did flip Guardian, it just wasn't enough. As good as Garrison is, it's not enough to win you the game on its own. Making a 4/4 every turn for what is essentially 6 mana is certainly strong, but if you're already far behind, your opponent can push through for lethal anyway. While it is really good against control decks are also the least likely to ever let you get the combo off in the first place. The card was just a little too hard to make, even for a card with a strong ability. And finally, at number 1, we have Conqueror's Galleon. This is a 2/10 artifact vehicle with a mana cost of 4. It has crew 4, meaning you can tap any number of creatures with a total power of 4 or more to turn into a creature until the end of the turn. It has the ability where, whenever it attacks, you exile it at the end of combat, then return to the battlefield transformed. When it transforms, it comes back as Conqueror's Foothold, a land with the abilities where you can tap it to add 1 colorless mana. You can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card, then discard a card. You can pay 4 and tap it to draw a card, and then you can pay 6 and tap it to return a card from your graveyard to your hand. So this card is pretty terrible. The issue is that the backside is just not really worth paying 4 mana, and essentially giving up a combat step to get. Galleon being a 2/10 means that it's both very easy to block, but very unlikely to die in combat, which means that it's not very hard to get away with attacking. The issue is that it's just a huge tempo loss, as tapping creatures with a total power of 4 will usually mean giving up attacking with any of your other creatures. The payoff for this is a land that's pretty good, but not really worth that much effort. It's worth comparing to cards like Gaia Reach Sanatorium or Ark of Orazca. The Sanatorium is a land that can tap for a colorless and allows you to pay 2 and tap it to make each player loop. This is worse than Galleon's ability, but all you have to do to get Sanatorium in play is, well, play it. It doesn't take any setup at all. And while giving your opponent a loot isn't great, if you build your deck to take advantage of it, it's actually still really strong. For example, you can do something really messed up by combining with cards like Narset, Parter of Veils, who stops your opponent from drawing more than 1 card each turn. So if you activate Sanatorium at the end of your opponent's draw step, after they've already drawn their card, you'll get to loot while Sanatorium will just make them discard a card. Ark of Orazca has Ascend, meaning if you have 10 or more permanents at any point, you get the city's blessing for the rest of the turn. This is just a distinction that certain cards, such as the Ark itself, will check for. Ark can also be tapped for 1 colorless mana and lets you pay 5 and tap it to draw a card. This is also worse than Galleon's ability, but it, once again, requires no effort at all on your part. Ark saw tons of play as a way to stay in the game if the game goes on really long, as if the game ends up going to turn 10 or more, it's not that unlikely that you'll hit 10 permanents at some point. The final ability is more unique, but it's very slow, and just not worth it at all. All in all, Galleon is just a really hard card to flip, and all it gives you is a land that's marginally better than other lands in the exact same standard format. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any of the cards you think we may have missed, or have any future ideas for similar videos like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.